Welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. Today we have Phil Cramer. And the last time we had Phil on the line, he was about to go down to Mexico. And so today we're going to be doing a little recap on how his Mexico experience this year went for Coues deer. And then he has also just recently went out to Florida and got his Osceola turkey, and so we've got a lot to talk about. Phil, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Jay. Thank you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. My wife and I just got done with our morning hike, and that's been good. It's been amazing to see with this, warm temperatures we've been having, abnormally warm. Everything is in bloom, and it's supposed to be 90, mid 90s today, whereas normally in March, it might be, 80. So it seems like the last couple weeks it's just been unbelievably warm. Almost feels like, early May. But I guess next week it's supposed to kind of cool back down into the 70s. So that, for me, that'll be welcome because it seems like we go straight from a little bit of winter that we have here straight into summer, and spring is very short. So I'll take those 75, 80 degree days and get as many of them as we can.
For sure. Yeah, it's definitely been warm, unseasonably warm. It's got the snakes out and moving, and like you say, everything's out in full bloom. So I'm looking forward to that little cool down next week and actually feel like some springtime weather. And of course, along with that comes the turkey hunting, which I know we both love. So,
boy, it's as warm as it is. It's around here anyway. I can't help but think those birds are probably thinking, what the heck's going on? And it might be an early season. First question of the day, Phil. The credit cards were getting hit yesterday, Friday the 17th of March, across the board. Any hits for you, or any positive news?
I tell you, I went into it with very little hope because my father and I and my daughter all had elk tags last year. Although I was kind of looking forward to maybe an antelope tag. Mm-hmm. But when I got up yesterday morning, got to work, wasn't even thinking about it, and then had a buddy of mine call me and say, "Hey, have you checked your account?" It reminded me. I hurry up and checked it, and I could not believe it when I saw a charge for an elk tag from Arizona Game and Fish. So
no way.
One of us is getting back-to-back elk tags this year, so we're pretty excited. And
who could it be? Tell me who.
It's either going to be my father or myself.
Oh, that's awesome. So did you guys do archery, or what did you do?
We did early archery, and those were the only choices. So regardless of who it is, it's going to be a good tag. So
that's awesome.
Looking forward to it.
So you did it. You have a single charge, so you know that one of you put in individually, so you know that one of you has a tag.
Yes, that's correct. Prior to this year, we had always put in together and, kind of put in our time until both of us could draw the tag. And after both of us drew this last year, we decided to split them up and kind of up our odds a little bit on one of us might be lucky and drawn, and it seemed to have paid off. So.
Well, good. Now, one of the good things is knowing that you have a tag, but one of the worst things is having to wait to see, what you drew and who drew. It could be a long 2 weeks.
It very well could. And I'm hoping my father drew, and he's hoping I drew, and I guess it really doesn't matter. We're both out shooting our bows and already excited for it. So
that's fantastic.
But you're right. It'd be a lot nicer to know exactly who and what unit. But we have a pretty good idea on where we'll be hunting. It's just a matter of finding out who's actually going to be doing the shooting.
Oh, that's great. Fantastic. Well, the last time we talked, we did a pretty in-depth podcast on kind of your ideas and perceptions of hunting in Mexico for Coues deer, and we talked a lot about, patterns, rutting patterns, movement patterns. You were talking about running a lot of trail cameras and kind of hunting more of a desert ranch. and I got a lot of good feedback from that podcast. I noticed here on your Instagram, and for those listeners, Cramer, that's with a C, Cramer Hunts, on Instagram. Looks like you shot a buck with a right main beam's got a dropper coming down, actually two droppers, but one looks like it's about 3 or 4 inches or so on his right main beam. Was that your target buck that you went into the season after?
It was, Jay, and I consider myself very fortunate to have been able to take that buck. It wasn't something easy. We had that buck on camera. This was the 4th year, so we knew he was getting up there in age. It was very interesting to see him grow a drop tine, and then the next year he wouldn't have the drop tine, but we could still tell it was him to a very unique eye guard. And then in November, we got pictures of this buck again. He was hitting 2 different tanks, about 1.5 miles apart, both of them fairly regular. So I went into the season, with very high hopes of harvesting them early and getting the job done. And we ended up with quite a bit of weather down there, and it changed their patterns considerably. But I stayed with it, and I think on the 7th day, it was the evening of the 7th day at 5:30, he showed up to the tank that I was sitting, and I was able to calm my nerves down enough to, make a pretty good shot. But that being said, I chose to use my rifle. He was definitely within bow range, but after putting in the time and everything, I picked up the gun and went ahead and took him with that. And you're right, he has 2 drop tines on the right main beam, just a great big old mature deer that we had a lot of history with, and it's one that I basically said I'm shooting that deer or I'm not shooting one this year. And fortunately the stars aligned, and good Lord willing, everything fell into place, and I was tickled pink with it, and I'm still kind of on cloud 9 over that deer.
I'm looking at your Instagram, and that deer, there's a picture with you, and then there's a picture with it on a trail camera. And is that a rope that he's got around his eye guard, or is that a stick, or what is that on? It looks like a night photo. It says, even with his camouflage, I was able to find him. What does he have going on there?
He's got a bunch of cactus wrapped around his antlers there.
Okay.
He must have gone through a pretty ruddy phase there around the middle of December and up until the middle of January. He was coming into both tanks pretty regularly, sometimes every day, and he'd do that for 3-4 days, and then he'd skip a day or two. But I have multiple pictures of him that he'd come in and he'd just have a big ball of cactus on his head or a tree branch, or he definitely was beating up quite a bit of the vegetation in the area there for a pretty good amount of time, and he carried it around for a while.
Yeah, I'm looking through here. It's pretty cool to see these photos. You have a bunch of photos of this buck. First question I would have is, so you noticed getting pictures of him on 2 different tanks you mentioned, and you mentioned that he would I assume October, November, early December timeframe, he would be on either or. Did you notice any sort of a pattern where, for a week or so he'd be on this one, and then, several times he'd hit, and then he would bump over and be on another one, and then, or was he just literally ping-ponging back and forth one day, one place? And with that, what kind of consistency did you see as far as how much was he watering?
He did actually have a pretty good pattern. He would hit each tank about 4 or 5 days in a row. Now, if he skipped a day or two, then, we wouldn't count that, and then he'd come back and he'd hit it. So I should say it hit each tank 4 or 5 times, and then it seems like we wouldn't see him for a day or two, and he'd show up on the next tank for 4 or 5 days or 4 or 5 times, and then flip-flop back and forth. And that pretty consistent pattern all the way through November, even all the way through December, and then in January, he started being a little bit more consistent on the one tank. He would still hit the other one, but he would only hit it maybe 1 day or 2 days, and then he would be back on the other tank. And And I was trying to figure that out. I spent a lot of time going through pictures of not just him, but the other deer that were using the tanks to see if maybe it was due to more does or something that was drawing him to that area for a longer period of time. And I really couldn't come up to any conclusions on that. So basically, when we got down to hunt, I set blinds on both tanks and checked the cameras, and he had hit one of those tanks that same day that I'd set up the blinds and checked the cameras. So I decided to go ahead and set that tank. And
wait a minute, let me
I was
just clear
fortunate.
that up.
Okay.
When you set your blind, did he hit the tank that you had set or another one?
No, he had hit the tank that I'd set.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I chose to go ahead and spend my time at that tank, the one he had watered at that day. And I was able, though, to every 2 or 3 days, either myself or someone else would be able to pull the cards off of the other tank, and he wasn't hitting that tank either. So I was pretty sure that the next time we would see him would be at that tank that I was sitting. The funny thing was, and kind of made it difficult, was we ended up on the third day, we ended up with a pretty good rainstorm, and it filled a lot of the puddles, and every morning walking to and from the tank I was sitting, you'd get wet up to your knees from the grass, and I think it put down enough moisture that they didn't have to water. We never had any pictures of this buck in the late afternoon, as in 3, 4, 5 o'clock. It was either in the morning time up to about noon, 1 o'clock, or it was at nighttime in the dark. And for whatever reason, whether it be the running pattern or the moisture in the air, that buck came in at 5:30 in the evening, and I just was happened to be sticking it out every day, for 10 and a half, 11 hours a day, sitting in that tank waiting for that buck. Now, if he would have been showing up at the other tank, then it would have thrown a whole different wrench into the game plan there, and I would have had to make some decisions. But he never showed up on any other tanks for 7 days. So I stuck with it, and it paid off.
That's awesome. Describe the country specifically that you're hunting between the two tanks, and maybe how within a ranch country can change or what have you, but specifically the country that you felt like this buck was using between the two tanks. Describe that in as much detail as you can.
You bet. I definitely can, because I spent a lot of time studying it, because I was trying to find a way or a vantage point that I might be able to get up and observe the deer, or even spot him and possibly make a stalk on him, or spot him and shoot him from where I had an opportunity to see him. And I just couldn't find that. And the reason being is the area in between the two tanks where this deer called home was low rolling ridges, and the slopes of the ridges, the tops of the ridges were very thick with mesquite, palo verde, ocotillo, and cactus, basically. The bottoms of the little draws in between the rolling ridges were very thick with bufle grass, more of your taller mesquite, palo verde, Oregon pipe cactus, even some, getting down into the bottom of the draws, even some of the evergreen type trees. It's not really a cedar, but it's a cedar type tree in the bottoms of the draws. And it was just so thick that there was no place I could find that would give me a vantage point to actually study or look into any of that country. I tried different spots around. I tried going, a mile and a half away and looking back into it, and there just wasn't anywhere there. And I believe that really had a lot to do with it, why that deer stayed in there, why he didn't really go out of that country. And in between the two tanks was only a mile and a half. And I firmly believe he lived basically his entire life in that, mile and a half area. There were plenty of does, there was great feed, and obviously there was enough water in between the two. And it was, very thick, very low elevation, desert type country.
Yeah, it sounds like he was somewhat living in those jungle areas where, as a glasser, you can just literally want to pull your hair out, because you're basically stuck with trying to sit and wait them out. And when time is precious for everyone, but when you don't have a month to sit there and wait them out, I'm sure as the days went by, you're like, come on, dude, just come, please, just come to, um, come to the water. So you got a storm that came in. I'm so curious about Coues deer and their behavior on the rest of the cameras on the ranch. Like, what did you notice as far as, well, first question, when was the dates of this? Was this, when in January was this? So I think that sets kind of a tone of my question. And then how quickly did all of a sudden you notice that the deer, does and bucks start coming back to water? Did it take 12 hours? Did it take 24 hours? Did it take, 2 days? What was kind of the general rule of thumb? And the reason for my question is everybody always wants to know, how long does it take them to get back into their pattern?
Okay, to answer the first question there, we headed down around January 16th, if I remember correctly, right in that area of time. And we got down there, deer were pounding. I mean, they were hitting water regularly. Some bucks were hitting tanks 2-3 times a day. It was hot. It was pretty dry. We were excited. Everything looked good. We knew there was a possibility of a storm. On the, the first day, a lot of action on all the tanks. The second day, one of our guys killed a 114-inch buck that we had never had on trail camera during daylight hours. He came in at like 1 o'clock, made a great shot on him, and great buck. The third day, killed a 121 that we had only had on camera 3 times previously in the whole year. So everybody was excited. Everybody was great. The third night we were down there, it rained and rained and rained and was still raining the next morning.
That was the same.
Now the funny thing is,
that was the same storm that blew the roof off the house we were staying in.
Yeah, I actually listened to that podcast, and I was thinking that thing. I was like, I remember that storm for sure. But the funny thing was, that next morning we still had a few deer hitting tanks, and it had rained almost all night. So it kind of kept your optimism up, that it was going to happen. But then the 4th, 5th, and 6th days was just nothing. I mean, we were lucky to see 1 deer, maybe 2 on any of the tanks that we had cameras on or that we were sitting. And it just slowed down for everybody. All of the cameras were just showing no activity. So judging from that, with that rain, to me, it seemed like it took a good 4 days before the deer started coming back into their regular routine of hitting water on a consistent basis. And on the 5th day after the rain, we started seeing that. We started seeing it on our cameras. We started seeing it on the guys that were sitting water still. We started seeing the activity pick up around the water significantly compared to those 4 or 5 days after the rain. So some of the conclusions I was able to make with that as long as there's enough water in their feed, and even some of the puddles that we're catching, they basically left the water alone. We still had your occasional deer come in, and I think it was more out of habit and them being in the area than actually wanting that water to come into. But by the 4th, 5th day after the storm is when everything really picked up again, and they kind of got back to their normal routine.
Yeah, one thing I would maybe observe from what you told me is, so the day after the rain, you noticed deer still coming to the tanks. I think sometimes I want to get your take on this. When you have a disturbance, when you have a storm come in that night, and the deer have been very patternable, I think it would be easy to think that those deer came back to the tank kind of as a gathering spot, kind of trying to figure out where their buddies are and what's going on. And then once they either regathered or regrouped or found where they were, then for 4 or 5 days, specifically you say 4 days, they didn't they were off getting plenty of water from the what they were eating and the puddles, and then all of a sudden I think that's one benefit. Well, there's many benefits, but one benefit to hunting a desert ranch, further south, like where you are, they can become very patternable in situations where it does get dry and it gets consistent. Where it throws a wrench in the plan is when you get any kind of inconsistency, because then they don't necessarily ever have to come to the water for days.
Yeah, for sure. And I would agree with you. The particular tank I was sitting during that time, in the 2 or 3 days, well, actually the first day after the rain and the second day after the rain, I noticed a lot of deer moving by the tank. So it's not like they quit using that area at all, but they would kind of not necessarily come over the berm and on into the tank. I could just see them out in that the tall buffel grass moving through the area and kind of hanging out in the general area. And those were the only 2 days that I actually bumped deer going to and from the tank. So like I'd park a quarter mile down the road and then I'd walk up through a draw. And the 2 days after the rain, I actually bumped deer moving to and from the tank. And I believe you nailed it right there, that they're still kind of using that area as a social gathering and feeding area. Even though they're not necessarily coming into the water, they're kind of getting their game plan together, if you will, or they're kind of checking on everything and see what's going on with the does or the other bucks.
There's a buck on on your Instagram. Again, it's Cramer Hunts with the C. That's facing the camera. It's at night. His eye guard's kind of tipped together. Looks like he's got, I think, 4 on his left side. He's got some sort of maybe a abnormal point or an extra of some sort on his left side. Is that a deer that ended up getting killed?
He did not. That's actually a holdover buck for next year.
And he looks like he's got a split route time. You call him lefty?
He does. Yeah, we call him lefty because he does have 4 on that left side. Mm-hmm. Just a great buck, and definitely one that was on the hit list. But he's a buck that we never could actually get a true pattern on. We knew he was hitting that tank, but we couldn't find any consistency to when he was hitting it. He would just show up, and then a week later show up one more time, and then 2 days later show up. And he's just, I guess, one of those bucks that's getting big because he's not necessarily patternable and consistent. But we have high hopes for him next year because he's just a great buck, really pretty frame, got a little bit of everything going on there.
He looks like he's got some age in the photo, but he doesn't look extremely old to me. I mean, he looks like he's a deer that could still continue to blow up. I'm only looking at this head-on shot, but I mean, he definitely looks mature. But to me, his face and his neck and the way his shoulders and everything, I think he still has room to, probably be even, more mature next year.
Oh, I agree with you 100% on it. And it was one that, he was on our hit list because he's a big deer, but he was one that you kind of don't really want him to get killed yet because he could blow up into a giant next year because I feel the same opinion of you that he's a mature deer, but he's not in that older age class yet. He doesn't have the big Roman nose. He doesn't have the sway back or the real deep brisket yet. And I think he's still got another year or two where he could just really hit his prime and blow up into a giant.
There's a picture here of a buck. It says the buck I named Flair. Moments after the shot, noticed the spot forming behind the shoulder. So you captured the shot. What buck is that? Okay, so that's a buck that my buddy Tim Maddox and I glassed up actually in November. And we put him in the 112 low side, 116 high side category. Mm-hmm. He was hitting the same tank as Lefty. And we decided Tim was going to sit that tank. And, basically we said whichever buck comes in first, either Flair or Lefty, is going to be in trouble. And it just so happened that we had never had any pictures of Flair in daylight hours. So I kind of thought that we would have a better opportunity of Tim killing Lefty. And on the second day, Flair showed up at 1 o'clock.
instantly Tim knew what buck it was. It was about 120 yard shot. He didn't waste any time. He got the gun up on him and just made a great shot on the deer. And when he walked up to him, there wasn't any ground shrinkage.
No,
It
I
was
was gonna
exactly
say,
what we thought he was.
yeah, he looks good. I love those bucks that have big long G3s, and I'm just looking at the one angle, and it's a little hard to tell, but it looks like his twos are pushing that 7.5, 8 range, but his threes, the way they lay, and kind of parallel his beam. I mean, his twos, or excuse me, his threes look like they're probably in that seven maybe more range. I mean, I see that buck being a 115 buck just from this angle all day long. I mean, real nice, solid frame, good eye guards. Beautiful
Yep.
buck, beautiful buck.
You nailed it. You nailed it. Right on the money right there. He's just shy of 115. He's 114 and high change. Great character, and like you said, the G3s are a little longer than the twos. He's got a little extra there coming off. Great eye guards. Just a phenomenal buck that we were all tickled pink to get on the ground and get our hands on for sure.
Yeah, and I noticed kind of so I can see the background of this tank. So this is one of the tanks that Lefty was also hitting. And so I kind of get a feel for what you're sitting there, as far as it looks like during monsoon times, the water backs way up and the tank's full. And then obviously towards January, the tanks diminish. So you've got lower water angle. But what that creates is, and I see big trees, a big canopy, it looks like, around the tank, or at least on the one side. This is real typical of your kind of low desert ranches, in what I call, that Hermosillo type area. One of the challenges for archers is these tanks, in the summer, they get filled up. It could be, 100 yards across. But then as the water decreases and it gets, they dry out, those tanks end up being, sometimes puddles that are only, 20, 30 yards across. And then they, on dry years, they go completely dry. But I guess my point is, I can see why you guys sit and have a rifle with you, because some of these shots, because of the size of the tanks, can be, probably 100, 150 yards across those areas.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Like that buck flare, the shot was 120 yards. Now he comes in on the other side. He's 20 yards from the blind, and as that water recedes, we're forced to put our blinds further and further away from the water. And I learned a pretty good lesson this year. I brushed in the front of my blind really good. I walked down to the water to look back at it. I was really happy with the setup. And the first day I was in it, I hear a buck spook that can't be more than 4 or 5 yards behind my blind. And I'm like, well, he didn't smell me. And the only thing I can think of is I didn't even bother brushing in the back of my blind, thinking that, well, he's got to come over the berm, he's got to go through the canopy of, the thick trees, and there's really no point in it. Well, I learned that the hard way this year, that I never did see what buck that was or what it could have been, because he spooked on it. And so that's why we have to put our blinds back in that tree line, and that forces us then to possibly have a lot longer shot. And that's why we do have a rifle with us, because a lot of the times we can't make that bow shot, and a lot of the target deer we're after, you might only get one opportunity, in 10 days at that deer. So we're willing to go ahead and pick up the gun and take the buck instead of letting him walk and hope for another opportunity.
For sure. Have you noticed any sort of pattern, specifically talking about, you're talking about brushing in your blind, but can you give any advice as to entry and exit points for these bucks on some of these big repressos, some of these big water tanks? And I know guys listening that are hunting Arizona Coues deer, the question always is, where are the deer going to come in? Obviously, you can look at tracks and try and see where they're coming in and out of, but is there any general rule of thumb that you've learned to to lean on the side of, XYZ. Anything you can share there?
Well, I learned a couple different things, and unfortunately, it makes it a little tougher when you're setting up. And you're exactly right. The tracks tell you part of a story where they prefer to come in and actually water at. But what I noticed this year from both cameras as well as sitting is they tend to come in to one or two areas on a tank or from one or two directions. And I noticed that it coincided with the wind. That, in the mornings, if the thermals were coming one way and the buck was coming in, he tended to have his nose right in the wind coming in. If it was in the afternoon and the thermals had reversed, that buck was coming in from the other side of the tank. Now, I think, and I believe, judging from what I was able to observe sitting in the tanks and actually seeing it with my own eyes, is they might come into one certain area and approach the tank, but then I noticed they would make a half circle or a full circle almost to get that wind in their favor, and then they would go ahead and basically pop out of the tree line and cross that open zone headed into the water. And the buck that I killed, the day that I set up my blind, he had come from, say, the west, right up over the dam, through the tree line, exposed himself all the way to the water, and I had 15 pictures of him in 5 minutes. The day that I killed him, it was in the afternoon versus when he had come in the morning. He came in on the completely opposite side of the tank, came in through the tree line, stood out there for probably 4 minutes before actually approaching the water. And I think they're doing that so they can check out the area. They're getting the wind right. They're using their senses to see what's around, what's been in, checking the area. I firmly believe for other bucks, other does, I was able to watch a couple bucks make scrapes right on the edge of the tree line before getting out towards the water. And I think they're using that as basically a communication source as well as making sure there's not something that's going to jump out and eat them when they approach the water. So I guess to summarize, yes and no. They have specific areas they like, but I think it depends upon which way the wind's moving and what time of day they're actually coming into water.
Phil, one question I would ask you is, what kind of densities, as far as, obviously you had a rough probably 4 or 5 days there after it rained, and you said, nothing really came in and everyone was reporting pretty slow. But let's say in a normal, consistent, let's say we've had, 10 days of consistent dry weather and they're kind of in their pattern, so to speak. Are you seeing, 10 does a day and 5 bucks coming in? Or what kind of action are you seeing? And it makes me think of a question I asked you on a previous podcast. If you had to specifically give a magic window, magic hours, when are those magic hours?
Okay, well, let me answer the last question you asked first. And time and time again, especially on a year that is consistently dry, the magic hour at the tanks is from 9 o'clock till 1 o'clock. And I know that's more than an hour, but that's when we see the majority of action coming into the tanks. Most of the guys don't necessarily get up early and get in the blind before dark. A lot of the guys are getting out at 1 o'clock, and if they haven't seen a deer between noon and 12:30, they'll go ahead and get out. That's because that seems to be when we see the majority of the deer coming into water. And we talked about that on a previous podcast there, and I think a lot of it has to do with where they're bedding and then feeding and before they get to water. But that seems to be the best time. As far as density-wise, we're hunting low-density ranches. A good day on the majority of the tanks, we're talking 4 does, 5 does, and maybe 1 or 2 bucks. We have a couple tanks that are higher density tanks that they, on a consistent basis, day in and day out, you're seeing 20, 30 deer where there's, 5, 6, 7 bucks coming in. They're definitely not some of the bigger bucks, but there's some really good ones that are coming into that tank. I think a lot of it has to do with that specific tank. There's not water anywhere close to it. I mean, we're talking 2-3 miles between that tank and another water source. So I think that tank's drawing from a lot bigger area, and therefore that's why we're seeing more deer. Typically, the average that we're seeing even on a consistent dry year is 5 to 10 deer a day and 2 or 3 bucks coming in. And we're seeing that on the cameras as well. This year, after I killed, Tim had already killed as well, and we got out, and there's a couple areas on the ranch that we can gain some really good vantage points from. And we got up there and we glassed, and we had probably the best day we've ever had, and we saw over 50 deer, and we saw over 10 bucks, racked bucks. We're not counting spikes or 2 points. And both of us looked at each other and said, wow, that was incredible. And it was one of those times where there were 2 or 3 hot does in the area, and it looked like ping pong balls bouncing all over the place. And it was one of those days that, as a Coues deer hunter, you live for. But that's not the norm, and that's not what we typically see down on, the type of ranches that we're hunting. Is the deer density is just not there. Now, the quality seems to be, and we proved it this year, with taking some great bucks, that as long as you have the time and you can put in the effort, that you can kill the bigger bucks without the higher density deer. It's a trade-off, you're not seeing near the deer numbers, but that giant might walk out, or the one that you specifically are hunting, you have a good opportunity to kill him.
You talk about consistency. I believe you run cameras all year round down there, but you talk about, consistent patterns in November and early December. If you had, let's just say that you had all the time in the world. Let's say that, it was a perfect world and you had all the time in the world to hunt these deer. Do you think you could be as effective in that November, early December time frame in sitting? I know, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. What's your answer to that question?
To that question is, I do believe you could still be successful. I think you would need more amount of time, a longer time period, because they're still going to hit it. The one thing you have going for you is down there, in the Hermosillo and a little bit further south area, is it's hot. And November, we're still, well up into the 90s a lot of times down there, according to our trail cameras and what we've seen. So I think they're relying on that water more of a daily basis than they are, say, later in the year when the temps cool down. So I do believe you could still get it done, especially focusing on a particular water hole. And it seems to be, before the rut kicks in, that those bucks are choosing one specific water hole, and they're making it a habit coming in and coming out. The downfall of that is, from what I've seen on our trail cameras, is the majority of them are hitting it at night, and they're hitting it during dark hours when the temperatures cooled down. And I think that would be your biggest disadvantage of that time of year.
What type of cattle interference do you have on these ranches? I assume they're working cattle ranches. Do you notice anything between the amount of cattle coming in, the amount of deer, or does it seem to not have any sort of relevancy to each other as far as, patterns and whatnot?
They are working cattle ranches, and I do believe it has a fairly significant effect on the deer. What I've seen, and we've been able to kind of observe this, and we've actually proved our theory a time or two, is that a lot of these tanks, they're like you said, they're great big repressos, and they have a lot of high canopy type trees around the banks and the berms, and the cattle will come in there and lay up and basically spend the majority of the day at that tank in the shade in the hottest part of the day. And then, as it starts to get a little later in the afternoon or earlier in the morning, they basically feed off. And from what we've seen on the pictures, is the deer don't tend to necessarily come in and spend near as much time when those cattle are at the tanks. What we've been able to do is we've talked to the ranchers, and when we go down typically after Thanksgiving, we'll have if the water's available, we'll have the ranchers actually move the cattle out of some of those pastures, and the majority of the tanks we're able to, close the gate and fence in where the cattle can't get in there. And the reason being is because we've noticed that we found that the deer don't necessarily like to come in when there's cattle laying around it all day. That's, not saying they won't. We've seen them come in at the same time that cows are there and everything. But from what we've been able to observe, both with the trail cameras and while we've been there, and especially after we've got the ranchers to start moving some of the cattle out when we come in to hunt, is the deer will come in a lot more frequent and more regular and spend more time when the cattle aren't on the tank.
What type of lion density are you seeing? Well, first question would be roughly how big of a property are we talking? And then the next question is, what type of lion frequency are you seeing on the cameras, and what does that lead you to believe as far as density of lions on this particular property?
We have this last year we had 7 ranches. They all bordering each other, so they touch. So we had close to 100 square miles. We had a lot of property, a lot of country tied up. That being said, we did not have one water source anywhere on those 7 ranches, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 Bevendettos that we did not have a lion picture on. Some of the tanks that seem to have the majority of the deer on too, the higher numbers of deer, we would have 3, 4, 5 lion pictures in a week's time, and some of them in the middle of the day. I was very surprised at how many lions this year we had during daylight hours versus typically we only get them at night. But I wouldn't hesitate to say that there's a lot of lions. As far as effect on the deer, I used to be one of those guys that said, hey, if there's a lion in an area, it's gonna muck out the deer herd. And from what I've seen down there, I think it plays a significant part on it. But I don't think it's necessarily true that it's going to wipe out or decimate the deer. I think there's a balance there. The other thing I've seemed to notice is that there's a lot of javelina, and it seems that we find more or as many, lion-killed javelina as we are deer. And I think that, they're animals of opportunity, and they're not, if they have the opportunity to kill a javelina versus expending the energy on killing a deer, then they're going to do it. The other thing that I'm a firm believer of is down on these desert ranches, the lions don't have those high vantage points just like we do, or don't, and I think it makes it a little tougher for them to kill a lot of these deer because they don't have the pinch points or the cliff to get on and have the deer come underneath them. So I guess in a roundabout way that we do have a lot of lions, and we had pictures of lions on every water source with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 on all 7 ranches.
When you get pictures of lions, do you typically get one lion, or is it real common to have, females with kittens, toms and females together? What are you seeing as a trend?
On a lot of the pictures we're getting, we've been able to identify, okay, that's probably a mom with 2, kittens that are reaching adulthood. Judging from the spots, the size of the bodies, size of the head. Very rarely have we gotten any large toms with any other lion, in the same picture. What we have noticed is on a couple of the tanks, we're getting probably 2, 3, and I think the most we've seen is 4 different lions that we're able to tell were actually different lions using that same water source, whether it be from judging from their size, their spots, their ears, their tail, whatever it might be, but distinguishing factors. And that really surprised me because I was more under the impression that if you had 1 or 2 lions in an area, that was kind of their home turf for whatever mileage, they covered. And you might have a little overlap. I was surprised that we had that many different lions in one area. Now, it very well could have been that it was last year's, kittens had grown up now and they hadn't quite got kicked out on their own or whatever it might be. But I know for sure we had at least 2 mature cats hitting the same water source. But the majority of the time, the larger toms are by themselves, and sometimes we'll get the females with, last year's kittens that are still following around. But the big toms seems to be almost all by themselves.
That's great stuff. Cool to observe that. I want to take a second here and thank the sponsors of this podcast. GoHunt.com insider Lorenzo Sartini and his crew over there do a phenomenal job with their insider, and I've been getting a lot of feedback from listeners who have joined the insider, used the JScott promo code. They've gotten the $50 Coues gift card, but they've been able to use the resource to look into the draw odds for Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, basically the western states. And I want to thank GoHunt.com for their sponsorship, and want to encourage you guys to use the JScott promo code when signing up. All you have to do is click the blue Join Now button, use the JScott promo code, and GoHunt's going to send you a $50 Coues gift card. I also want to thank Coues, Jason Hairston, March 1st has stepped up to sponsor the podcast, and we're going to have some great things going on here with Coues that I'm going to be announcing later. And I actually just spent a day out at Coues and got to tour the warehouse and meet all the people in customer service and go through the whole headquarters there in Dixon, California. And encourage you guys. Dara and I have been wearing Coues since Jason started the company, and we really like the product. Phil, I know you like Coues as well. I see you wearing it, and want to thank them for their sponsorship. Also, the Outdoorsman's, the Optics Authority, there, Cody Nelson and his group there in Phoenix, Arizona. If you use the JScott promo code, you're going to get a 10% discount there. And then Cheston Davis in Beaver, Utah with phonescope.com. Use the JScott16 promo code and get a 10% off discount at Phonescope. What Phonescope does is they take any phone and they adapt any phone to any optic so that you can take photos and video right away. These are custom molded cases and a real slick device to get good digiscoping. So I want to thank my 4 sponsors here at the podcast. Phil, I'm looking here at your Instagram, and there's a buck that's got a split G2. His eye guard on that left side is kind of forked. He's got a little cheater on the inside of his beam. Looks like a mature, you can see the Palo Verde around his burrs. His beam on the left side's kind of bladed, kind of palmated, just a really neat, one of those bucks that regardless of score, whether he scored, 110 or 140, just a really neat deer with extras and kicker. And it looks like this deer's got some age on it. What's the status, or what's the deal with this buck?
I can't really nail him down off of that description. It sounds.
It says another hitless buck that we were able to ground check last month, nicknamed Macho.
Okay, yeah, Macho is a phenomenal buck.
Yeah,
actually one that we have been after in a roundabout sort of way for the last couple of years. You're familiar with it, that you get down there and there's, you ask one of the vaqueros, hey, where's the biggest deer at? What have you seen? And they always kind of come up, oh yeah, Muy Grande over here, And
yeah.
You're always kind of suspect on, well, I wonder if they really know what a big buck is. But anyway, for the last couple of years, there had been a story that no matter which cowboy we had talked to, they had told us there's, a 12-pointer over here, and he's just a huge buck, a macho buck.
Why is it always a 12-pointer? Because every ranch I go to in Mexico, I ask the same question in my Spanglish. I'm asking, where is the number one buck, the primero, the biggest buck on the whole ranch? And every single time it's a 12-pointer. How many points?
Yeah.
12. I mean, it's just like, come on. Yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah, but that's the same thing. I mean, we've heard it too, and you're kind of like, okay, yeah, whatever. But the difference is this year is when Tim and I were down there setting our trail cameras and going about kind of our routine on getting the cameras out and scouting, we actually come across a shed where the cowboys had told us this great buck lived. And we'd never seen it, never had a picture of it. And this shed, we measured out, and we're like, wow, if this thing matches the other side, we're looking at a 120-inch deer. And he had a couple extras and everything, and we're like, man, maybe there's some truth to this story. So we just absolutely covered up the area in trail cameras. I mean, there's a couple tanks in there, and we had 14 cameras on one of them. We had 11 cameras on the other. We're like, if this is true, we're going to see this deer. And sure enough, we got pictures of this deer, and we're like, wow, that's a great buck. One of our friends was able to actually go in there and kill him on the third day he showed up. Just a phenomenal deer. He's got big, heavy bladed beams and extras and, 3 points on one eye guard, and just a phenomenal deer. So we kind of joked that the legend of Macho, was over. We killed him, and he ended up going 121 and I think like 3/8 or something. Just a phenomenal buck. But yeah, that's the one that we were so happy to get and get pictures of, or otherwise we probably wouldn't have even been fitting those tanks. So.
It brings up a question it's a heck of a deer. People should go check it out on your Instagram page. It's a really, really neat deer. It looks like it's just a mature deer. It's got a really neat look to it. It brings up a question of how do you pick tanks, or what kind of advice could you give people that are hunting Mexico for Coues deer, hunting Arizona, hunting New Mexico? Like, obviously you're running trail cameras and that gives you a lot of intel, but is your mindset to cover every single tank and just see what happens, or are there certain things that you're looking for that make you pick tanks that you want to put cameras on? And I guess take that a step further as you're answering, for people out there that are listening that are hunting public land and they have lots of tanks to choose from. Like, what are things that you would look for?
Okay, we do. When we get out there and are first setting up the cameras, we do try and cover up as many tanks as we can. That being said, we don't cover them throughout the year. There's a lot of water sources that we won't have a camera on because we just know, or we've been able to determine that it's not worth our time going in and setting them up. And what we typically look for, and we always joke about it, whether it's true or not, I'm not 100% sure, but we always say a big track always equals a big rack. A big rack doesn't always equal a big track. And we'll go in and we'll spend a lot of time, looking for tracks and seeing the size of the track and basically trying to get an idea on the frequency of him using a specific water hole. The other thing we look at is the surrounding area. Is he got enough cover where he's going to be, consistently in that area, or does he have to travel a long way to cover for his bedding area, for feed? All of those things kind of play into it. Some of these, ranches, you'll go up down a long wash where there's very little vegetation, and then there's a huge water source that might have a track or two on it, but it's not one that you would consider setting because they're more likely not going to show up there. They're not going to cover all of that open country to go hit that water source. So we look at the surrounding area, but more importantly, we look at the tracks. And we look at the amount of tracks and then the size of the tracks. And then we try and focus our trail cameras on those areas that, one, are producing the amount of tracks that we think is going to draw in a big buck. Because we're not just looking for big buck tracks, we're looking for the amount of does hitting the water as well, because we're focusing our time during the rut, because we're trying to make the best use of our time. And I would do that, and I do it in Arizona as well on public land. I try and find the water sources that, one, have good amount of deer on it, two, might not be as pressured by people, and then three, have all of the same things that I just discussed, the feed, and the cover, and being able to approach an area without having to be exposed for long periods of time. And the more human pressure they have, I think that becomes a lot more important, especially, on public land, and like here in Arizona where there's kind of limited sources for these deer to use, but also narrowing down, for hunters to use and choose as well. So instead of going out there and trying to cover up every single source, go in and look for those things and try and make your.
It brings me up to a question of human pressure. And do you notice on these ranches in Mexico, well, let me ask, with human pressure in mind, are there times when you just hop in your side by side or your truck or whatever, and you just buzz around the ranch and you just pop out and you're just grabbing cards and putting new cards in? You're really not paying any attention to, like, you're just buzzing up to the tank, middle of the day or whatever, you're just popping, blowing, and going. Do you notice that messes them up at all? Like, or do you see pictures right away? Oh, a buck came in, 30 minutes after I was there refreshing the cards. Do you notice that pressure scares them off or anything like that?
Down there, what we've seen is, and typically when we go down after Thanksgiving, most of the time during the day, we're not even, taking a tripod or a spot and scope or anything. We are just covering country, setting up cameras, trimming brush, and we'll be at a tank sometimes an hour and a half, 2 hours. Doing some landscaping basically to eliminate false pictures and get better angles on our cameras. And when we're doing that type of activity around a tank, typically we won't see anything that first day, or into that night is when typically they first start coming back into the tank. So I think even though they're not necessarily associating us with a lot of danger, we're messing up their routine, and they can smell us, they can hear us, they know we're there. Now, it changes a little bit as we get more into the actual hunt, later in December, January. We do exactly what you just said. We'll jump into side-by-side. We'll say, okay, I'm going to hit these 5 tanks. You jump in your truck, you go hit those 4 tanks, and we're just in and out, pulling cards. And when we do that, we'll have a picture of deer sometimes within 30 minutes after we've pulled that card. So I think it depends on the amount of time you spend at that particular area and how much disruption it actually does to their normal routine. And also by then, the cameras have been up for 3-4 months, and I think they're kind of used to them. We don't leave them out year-round. We typically put them up in November, and we pull them into January, February, somewhere in there. So I think, going back to your original question, the pressure-wise, if you're in and out, we try and take the same route in and out as well. It's not disrupting their routine. They might catch a whiff of you, but they're not going to associate it with changing their pattern. When we go in and we spend an hour, 2 hours setting things up, we disrupt their routine, and typically it takes a day for them to get back into it.
You talk about false photos, and I want to ask you about camera setup. Give me some tips and things you've learned on how to not get as many false photos, and tips you've learned as to camera direction and what you found, as far as placement, angle, what have you, what have you learned?
You want to try and keep it as north and south as possible. That eliminates your morning and evening sun. When you're trying to catch specific areas, a lot of times that's impossible to do. So when you have those areas that your camera's pointed into, say, a rising sun or a setting sun, you have to do your best to eliminate the background noise, is what I call it. Your tree limbs that, not necessarily your limbs that are, big mature trees, but your little limbs that have foliage on them, a lot of the greenery. I'll take almost like a rake and try and knock down the majority of the grass in front of the camera. And speaking of that brings me to another point that we've learned is, if you have the ability, try and get that camera at the deer's eye level. If you get that up and facing down, it kind of gives you a different perspective on their antlers. You also are covering you have a less area of detection, and you get better pictures if they're actually at eye level.
Now, obviously, your eye level or the deer eye level?
The deer's eye level. So typically it's our chest height. Okay. Is where we like to have the camera, and that puts it about the deer's eye level when they're coming or going. On public land, what I do is typically I'll get them up higher and aim them down so the camera's less visible. But down in Mexico, we're not worried about that. So we're going strictly off of our best opportunity to catch a deer with as minimal amount of false pictures as possible. Along those lines, what we found too is that if you have an approach, if you have a camera that's basically pointed directly at where the deer will come or go in a straight line, that's when we miss the majority of the animals. What we like to do is try and have them walk at an angle past the camera, and we will pick it up more times than not, whereas if that animal has to walk straight to the camera or straight away from it, we'll actually not get a picture of it. And that kind of blew me away. I've been sitting in tanks before, and I think, oh, man, I'm going to get a great picture of that deer, and I'll go pull that card that night, and I won't have a picture of the deer. Whereas if the deer crossed in front of it at an angle, then I'll have 2 or 3 pictures of the deer. So that was a pretty good learning, curve for us on how to place the camera, where to place it to get the best shot on what we're actually trying to achieve.
Do you feel
a lot of
like
times on these big?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Do you feel like a perfect 90-degree, in essence, if your camera is facing, let's say it's facing north, and you're on a trail, when you're talking about an angle, you'd rather have quartering angles rather than just perfectly perpendicular where they might just boom walk through the path, right? Don't you want to have where they're going to hit that laser beam, they're going to be at a 45, so to speak, either coming or going, so there's more surface area? Or is it, am I wrong that you would rather have it be a perfect 90 where they just walk by?
What we try and do is 45 angles. 45-degree angles seem to work best. The 90-degree angle is good, and you're going to get, basically the full silhouette of that animal going by. The problem with that is a lot of times we'll have them set on, 5-picture bursts because you want as many different angles in that short amount of time that he's in front of your camera. So where we found is that if you can get it at a 45, you're reducing the risk of missing that animal where it's coming straight in or straight away, but you're also increasing basically the span that you have of that animal in front of your camera. So if we can, we like to put them at 45-degree angles. And what I was going to say just a little bit ago is we like to drive a fence post in, basically, and it really works good on these big repressos where the water is, shrank or dried up to the point where they're not along the tree line anymore. We'll drive a fence post in probably 10 yards back from the water, and then we'll actually put 2 cameras on that fence post. So there won't be one shooting straight at the water, but it'll be shooting one on each edge of the water, and that gives us our 45-degree angle where we get the best coverage for that particular area.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And do you find that you are putting way more cameras on fence posts than, and you're talking metal fence posts, than, say, on trees and such? And does that help with, them waving around and branches getting in the way and all of that? And did the deer pay any attention to that fence post?
We would prefer to put them on fence posts if we could, for the reasons you just said. You typically don't have to trim near a big area and worry about the false pictures. And the other thing, and they are metal fence posts, what we will usually do is we'll actually take a limb from a tree and actually wire that to the post and then wire the cameras to that limb and the post. And what that does, it gives you a better mounting area for your camera. As far as the deer are concerned, they don't pay hardly any attention to the cameras. Typically, when they first show up, you might get a deer or 2 looking at them. But other than that, it doesn't seem to bother them at all. Even at night, I've heard a lot of different things with flashes and this and that. And I think the deer are aware of them, but I've never had any of them spook over them. And I think they get used to it, and it provides us with a lot better camera setup on putting them on the posts.
Speaking of cameras, what kind of cameras do you use and why? What have you found to be the best, and, what are you using? Especially this year, we did a lot of experimenting with different cameras. But by far, what we've gone back to that is our best consistency,
fewest false pictures, longest battery life, and best trigger speed is the Brownings. The fives, the HTC fives, BTC fives, they're a very good value for your money. If you pay attention and watch online, you can get them for around $100 a camera. They run off of 6 AA's. They take up to like a 32 gigabyte card, and by far they've been our most consistent performer out of all of them. Covert's a great camera. What we found with the coverts, though, is no matter what setting you have them on, they're very, very sensitive. So what we'll typically do on our coverts is we'll take tape and basically tape over the majority of your whole sensor window and leave a very small area. And without having to do that, that's why we just keep going back to the Brownings. They're a great camera, and it's one we prefer. They actually take really good video, too. And we've been playing around with that where we'll have one camera set on video mode, the other camera set on stills. And now with the technology, actually, a lot of the cameras are coming out where you can do a hybrid mode where it'll take a still and then activate the video all at the same time. So they're a lot of fun. They're great to use. They can be really frustrating when you get there and you're just so excited to see a picture and the camera didn't work or you forgot to turn it on. But that happens. We ran 83 cameras last year, so there's going to be some that just aren't quite working.
How many cameras do you own personally?
I think I'm up to around 28 now, pushing 30. I'm constantly upgrading, and you'll get one that might have a glitch in it, so you kind of shove it out of your arsenal.
Cull it out of the herd.
Yeah, exactly. It's been upgraded to a different model, but yeah, I think I'm pushing 30 right now on my cameras
Nice.
that I own personally, and then I think Tim's probably got 60 or 70, and then a couple of our other guys pitch in 2 or 3, as we need them. So.
Do you is Tim still using those 40 super wide angle doctors that I sold him?
I haven't seen them because on our ranch we really don't have the area to be busting them out, but I wouldn't be surprised if he is. I just haven't seen them.
Gotcha. So obviously you're excited for next year, and you've learned a lot, and it's obvious you have a passion for it, and there's a lot to it. It sounds like it's just a constantly learning, and that's one of the things that I like about Coues deer is it seems like you're always constantly tinkering and trying to learn, and they're just an incredible animal. Would you agree?
I would agree 100%. Especially, that no matter what, every time you think you've got them figured out, then they throw something different at you, and you're like, wow, never seen that one before. And you just try and file it in your memory bank and use that as your, in your arsenal for the next time that you're out there in the field. No matter what, whether you kill one or you're just taking pictures of them, they're such a neat animal. They're a beautiful creature. I love their configurations of their antlers, and they're great to eat too. Super excited for next year. We've got a lot of bucks that were on our hit list this year that we didn't kill, and that's fairly unusual. I mean, normally we'll have our hit list and maybe 1 or 2 show up that we weren't expecting, but this year we killed some bucks, on the fringes that we were targeting, and it worked out, but we also didn't kill, all of our hit list bucks, and that makes it really exciting for next year.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. You are a turkey nut as well, and I know your daughter had gotten her Osceola turkey, and then you also got a Gould's tag, and you signed over your Gould's tag to her, and she got her Gould's, and you went down this spring and went to Florida and got your Osceola, and I believe you're both scheduled to go get your Easterns for your I guess it would be her Royal Slam, and you still need a Gould's. But tell me about this Osceola hunt.
You're right. I'm a turkey nut as well. I absolutely love spring turkey hunting. You're right again, too. I drew a Gould's tag, signed it over to my daughter. She killed a beautiful bird. I took her to Florida, actually, last year on the Florida youth hunt for the South Zone. And Went to a place called Swamp Gobbler Outfitters, ran by Ben and Charlie. Great guys, down to earth people. Just we had an absolute blast. I mean, a lot of fun. They had never guided a youth hunter, let alone a girl. So they were, a little nervous going into it. Needless to say, we hit it off right off the bat, and she took one. So I needed my Osceola, so I went ahead and booked a hunt for this year. I just got back this last week. Had a phenomenal trip. I mean, I don't want to use nickel words, but it was an epic hunt. We got there. I already kind of knew the guys. We'd stayed in touch throughout the year, so I knew exactly what was going on. No doubt in my mind we'd be on birds, and we got set up next morning. They called them in off the roost. I mean, textbook, everything worked perfect. I wasn't comfortable with the shot, so I let the bird walk off. We started running and gunning, called in another bird. I was able to take him. Just a great Osceola. Ended up with 11-inch beard. Big old long spurs on him, which they're known for. A phenomenal hunt. And then I was able, since I filled out early, I was able to stay there and, help with the other hunter till he took his bird, and then help around the ranch and got to do some scouting with the guys. And Osceolas, for those who haven't hunted them, they kind of have a short, fast gobble. They're not quite as vocal as some of our Merriams and our Goulds, but they're a smaller bird. They have black wings, and the country they live in, in the Everglades with big palmettos and pine trees. It's just a different experience than what we get out in the West, and a lot of fun. And I recommend anyone that needs to get their Osceola to do it, because it's a blast, different experience, but yet at the same time you're still chasing that goblin turkey and trying to bring him into you and roost him, and the whole setup that we go through out here. It's just in a different environment. And, really kicked off to a great start to the season. You're right again. My daughter and I are booked to go to Missouri. We're actually going to hunt the last 3 days of the Missouri season due to her softball schedule. So I hope that the birds will still be working pretty good and we're able to get it done. But in between now and then, I'm going to Texas actually this next week to try and kill a Rio with my bow.
So am I.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Right on. Good job.
I didn't know you were going to Texas. Yeah, I'm going. We've got the Desert Christian Archers NWTF turkey banquet on Tuesday night, and then that following that morning, I'm flying to San Antonio to go and take my bow and try and shoot Rio Grandes with my bow. So that's cool. You're doing it too?
I am, yeah. Actually, I'm leaving on Thursday.
Where are
through
you?
My work, I actually have a couple rigs working out in Texas. They're in Monahans, Texas right now, so I'll go see them on Thursday and then head down to Sonora, Texas, actually, off the 10 there on Friday and spend the weekend there. There last year, I took my daughter out there and she killed her Rio, so I'm familiar with the area. I kind of know the setup a little bit, so I have high hopes that hopefully the birds are working and I'll be able to pull one in. Over there, they're pretty lenient and on tag wise, so I think they typically give 4 tags in most counties. Where I'm hunting, I have an arrangement with the ranch owner that I can take 2 birds, so I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it for sure.
Yeah, Texas is definitely a target-rich environment, and I love the 4 tags, and I'm looking forward to the trip as well. So that's awesome. So you're gonna be shooting some turkeys this year. You've already shot your Osceola, and they're just beautiful. All the black on those birds are really neat. I'm looking forward to someday getting my Osceola. But yeah, it's that time of year. I love the spring. I love turkey hunting, and I know you do too. I want to ask you a couple quick questions. I noticed your photo of your Osceola and your photo of your Coues deer down in Mexico. You're wearing Coues, and I wanted to ask you what is kind of your general go-to setup, as far as Coues gear on the deer hunt, And then the same question with the spring turkey hunt, or the Osceola hunt that you just did. What pants, what shirt, like what is your go-to on that?
Yeah, for sure. I started wearing Coues a few years ago. It's just so comfortable, as you know, and such a good high quality product that now I'm a firm believer in it and a diehard. And on the deer, basically I'm wearing a Teton or even an attack pant. But the difference is that I'm layering them, and typically underneath I'll have the merino wool, their zip-offs. And same on the top, I might have the merino wool or even a Pelton 140 or 200 or whatever it might be, and just layer them up, and then that way, as the day progresses or you're a little bit more active, just start stripping it off. The one thing that I'll do on the deer hunts is I always have the super down with me, so that way if I'm not moving and it's cold, that I can throw that on and shoot, I never get cold. And then on the turkey, I'm basically wearing the same thing. The Teton pant and the Teton shirts, they're fairly lightweight, they're breathable, and especially down like in Florida where I was, everything's super green. And I found that the Verde pattern seems to really hide yourself, blend in well. Now when I go some of the different areas, I'll wear the bias pattern, which is a little bit lighter, a little bit bigger pattern that I think helps break up your outline. But the Teton, the Tiburon, and the Tax are kind of the three lines that I wear. And I basically wear the same thing, just with different amount of layers underneath. And that way, I'm able to strip them down as I get heated up, or as the evening gets cooler, I can layer back up. When they came out with their zip-offs, their bottoms and everything, that just such a huge advantage because you don't have to take off your boots. I mean,
Yeah.
you can be warm in the morning, and as soon as you start, the temperature starts climbing, just zip those things off, throw them in your pack, and away you go. And that's just a huge advantage to me, being mobile, being light, not having to bulk up with a lot of extra gear.
Yeah, for sure. I really like those Tiburon pants for turkey hunting, just because the way the air flows through them, and for warmer temps, it's great. But it still gives you coverage, as far as having a camo pattern. Some of the Gould's turkey hunts I do down in Mexico, it starts getting warm, and that's where that Tiburon, really comes in. And like your deer hunts, even in January, you can be cold in the morning, but like you said, it could be 85 degrees during the day where you hunt, and that Tiburon is just so nice because it lets the air pass through. But yeah, that's cool. I saw you wearing it, and so I was going to get your take on that. And well, man, it's been awesome having you on here, and I'm excited to see how you guys do. I'm excited to see how you do with your archery Rio Grande hunt in Texas, and then be watching for you and your daughter, and give her a congratulations when she gets her Eastern and completes a Royal Slam. That's fantastic, and I'm proud of you for getting her out there. And I don't know her, but it looks like she really enjoys it and likes spending time with you and spending time out there hunting. And hats off to you for getting her involved. And I think that's so important. And yeah, just great picking your brain and talking to a fellow Coues nut about your experiences down there, and wish you the best of success next year. I'm sure I'll be talking to you before then, but congrats on you guys' success that you had. Shot some great bucks, and encourage anyone to definitely check out Phil's Instagram page, Cramer Hunts. That's with a C, Cramer with a C. And Phil, any parting words or any last final comments?
Not really, Jay. Just thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to a gentleman like yourself who loves outdoors and in it for all the right reasons. And as far as getting my daughter out there, she's been probably one of my best friends and hunting partners in the world. I cherish every moment that we're able to spend, and I recommend anyone that can take a kid hunting, because it's so rewarding and so much fun that makes it all so worthwhile. And man, I hope you have the best of luck and over over there in Texas and able to get a reel or two with your bow. And I look forward to it, and I thank you for putting on the podcast. They're really enjoyable.
All right, buddy. Sounds good. Well, God bless. Take care, okay?
Thanks. Yeah, you too.